Hello everybody, this is Magda Giurcanu from National Louis University, and together with Joe Rice, we are organizing a series of interviews with public officials and community organizers to explore civic initiatives in the Chicago area. We are the Growing Democracy Group, an interdisciplinary effort committed to youth engagement. We hope you enjoy our episodes.
Karen is joining us, and she has an extraordinary background related to youth empowerment and community work. I'm going to allow Karen to introduce herself and kind of explain a little bit about the trajectory of where you've been and where you're going.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I started in community work, I guess really during college. I started at UIC, actually, right out of high school. And one of my professors, a man by the name of Dick Simpson, in the political science school there, and also is an ordained minister, and just had a big impact on me early on. And then I ended up dropping out of UIC 3 times with intention of going to Berkeley. And I did not make it to Berkeley, but I did learn to carry 3 glasses in one hand as I was waiting tables and cocktailing, which is actually a big life skill. I ended up going back to Loyola, and I got my degrees at Loyola in psychology, Latin American studies, and Spanish. And in that time of being on breaks from school, I had gone to Mexico and just felt very much at home there. Just felt very comfortable and really wanting to dive in more to working in Mexico, and that just kind of changed the direction of my life. Interestingly enough, it was through National Louis that I ended up going to Mexico, because I came here with my roommate at the time who was interested in going back to school to become a teacher, and the admissions counselor, I just offered to come with him because he hadn't had any background in college, and I offered to come along for moral support. The admissions counselor had a picture hanging behind her desk, and it was a woman on horseback with really long black hair, and I said, "Oh, are you Native American?" And she said, "No, I'm Mexican American." And in passing I said, "Oh, I always wanted to go to Mexico." And she said, "Well, I'm going in a couple of weeks, you should come." And I was like, "No." And so then we left, and my roommate looked at me, he's like, "You're gonna go, right?" I was like, "No, I can't. I don't even know her. Like, I can't go, and I have no money." And he said, "You should go." And I said, "No, really?" And well, so I did end up going, and that just completely changed the trajectory of my life. Her brother, who I actually never did get an opportunity to meet, but he was a housing organizer on the southeast side of Chicago in the Bush, which is where my family also came when we immigrated from Poland and worked in the steel mills there. So her brother was then later assassinated in a hit that a landlord had put out on him because of his organizing activities for tenants' rights. So interestingly, the school that my mother attended as a child is now named after her brother. And then I just did some community work in Logan Square after graduating. I worked as a rape crisis counselor, but I was out in the community more doing work. We had typically been headquartered downtown, but we had gotten a grant to do community-based sexual assault services. So they got a grant to pay a person, but they didn't have any money for occupancy. So I had to basically go out into the community and find a place to set up shop, and that started a lot of the community work that I was doing, and that was between Logan Square, Humboldt Park, and West Town. And then I decided, although I loved counseling, I saw this transformation happening in people as I was working with them, but I still felt like I wanted to make an impact on a bigger scale. So that's when I decided to go back to school and study public policy. And so I did go to University of Chicago, just to call it SSA, but now it's the Crown Family School of
Social Work.
And it was interesting because then I did start doing policy work and still focusing on community development work in public policy, but I was then working in philanthropy, and I became kind of disillusioned with policy because I felt like really you can write great policies, but if you're not working with people to implement the policies, they just are going to kind of sit on a desk somewhere and collect dust. So I came to believe at that point that really how change is made, you do need good policy, but how change is actually made is really through relationship.
So what you're saying is very important, right? The connection, the youth, that we're looking at and how they understand policy and how they see the effect of policy on them. And given your experience with the youth on the West Side, could you give us some examples of projects that you worked on where you could see that they make the connection?
I came to Little Village in 2007 and actually came there to review Chicago Youth Boxing Club for a grant. I was working part of the Funders Collaborative for a group at the time that was called Hispanics in Philanthropy. So we were doing capacity building grants for Latino-led and Latino-serving nonprofits. And Chicago Youth Boxing Club, or CYBC as we call it, was the smallest organization that applied. And at the time they had just been open a little less than a year. They, in fact, had their grand opening the month that I visited them. And so they needed a lot of capacity building support, which I just volunteered to do. And then we got a grant from Open Society Foundation. It was interesting. It was to do a project called Too Young to Die in partnership with a documentary photographer named Carlos Javier Ortiz. And Too Young to Die was actually the name of his photojournalism project. And this was an audience engagement grant. So the idea was that we would take his photos. He had been documenting gang violence in Chicago for about 10 years at that point under Too Young to Die. And we would show them to the youth in the boxing program to see kind of how they responded. And the idea of it came because when he first came in and he had a book of his photos, and I brought a couple of the youth into the office at the boxing gym just one at a time. And what was so interesting to me was that every single one of the youth that I talked to individually knew somebody, either personally or indirectly, that was represented in those photos that I did not expect. So it was a very personal connection that they were making off the bat, but they didn't necessarily have the words to then kind of process that. So the thinking was that we could give them other ways to try to process that through art or through whatever sort of their medium of choice might be, but the intention of it was to be very organic. What was so interesting to me as we started sitting down though and talking with them was that they really didn't want to talk about that type of violence. They didn't want to talk about the gun violence. In fact, they were very resistant to it because they felt like that was all anybody, adults, wanted to talk to them about related to their community in particular, and that this was just something that they were kind of tired of that being the only issue people wanted to talk about, that was kind of how their community was portrayed, because that was, and it is a very small but very visible part of the community that is involved directly in that type of violence. The thing that actually kept coming up over and over for them was food. It was the food that they were being served in their school cafeteria, and it was the way that they described it, like going through basically a concentration camp line and having food slopped on their plate literally with roaches, and that was just the recurring theme. So then we just started talking, okay, well, let's talk about food, because that's a whole other level of violence, right? That's kind of getting into the administrative type of violence that a lot of youth experience on a day-to-day basis, and it's just not what is covered in the media. But those are the issues that really do affect their day-to-day in many ways, more so than even the gun violence.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and we should mention that we met at that expo, right? That was focused on violence in Chicago, and that's how I became aware of your work, and it was very interesting exactly presenting this youth boxing club that you mentioned. In addition to that, there was also La Vita Church. Represented there. Could you explain a bit?
Yeah, so Chicago Youth Boxing Club is actually in the basement of La Vita Community Church. So it's a little bit sort of unexpected, right, to have a boxing gym in the basement of a church. It was actually kind of funny when the boxing gym first started there. During the first show, we actually set up the boxing ring in the sanctuary, and one of the members walked up to the pastor at the time and said, "Yeah, Pastor, I don't know how I feel about this. I'm not really sure that this is the right decision." And one of the bouts had just ended, and the pastor, was Pastor Victor, he said, "Well, I'm not sure I agree either. I think the guy in the blue corner should have had it." So that was basically the end of that conversation. And the boxing gym has now been there since 2006. it started in the basement of the church. It was the first nonprofit youth boxing organization. I didn't start it, but I was there involved very early on, and I was the executive director on a volunteer basis for 3 years. So it's thriving. It's doing very well. We had started at that time the Power Gloves tournament, and Power Gloves just passed a couple of weeks ago, and it's become one of the bigger youth boxing tournaments now in the Midwest. So I didn't actually come in through the church. I personally come from a background of a lot of church trauma. So I was very resistant at first with the idea of the church, and so I was very just sticking with the boxing gym, and pastor and I did, we kind of mugged each other for the first couple of years that I was there, and he wasn't really sure about me and I wasn't sure about him. But then as trust built over time, we ended up becoming very good friends, and it was kind of a good exchange because I was able to help the boxing gym get established, and I ended up regaining or gaining, I guess, for the first time, trust in God at the same time.
What do you think it is about a church setting that provides such a strong avenue for community engagement for young people as well as for people who might have had, like you said, a negative experience with church, but then able to turn it around?
So I do think that the pastor of La Villita Community Church passed away in 2019, and his name was Pastor Victor Rodriguez. I do think that he is a bit unlike many pastors. One of the youth that I became very, very close to, a young man named Frederick, he was the first member of the boxing gym, and Pastor Victor had kind of helped to raise him and his siblings. And at one point when Frederick was about 12 years old, he was out doing something he shouldn't have been doing to Pastor Victor's car. Pastor Victor saw him, chased him down the street, tackled him, and then Frederick punched him in the face, and Pastor Victor's response was, "That's a pretty good right hook there. We're starting a boxing gym. Are you interested?" So he literally was there at the door waiting the day that boxing gym opened. So he was what gained my trust with him, and I think I could say many others, was that he would always say, if you want to teach the Word of God, don't use words. And so it was just for him very much how you are actually walking and relating with people, and not so much can you quote a whole bunch of scripture, but how are you showing up in the world?
It makes sense that he preferred an embodiment approach because words fail, and words have been used over and over with young people that don't connect. But when you're talking about boxing, what is more embodied than that? Competitive sports, and then using the church setting as a way to maybe create a sense of community around it.
So the thing about boxing, I did not come into being the administrator of a boxing program knowing anything about boxing or I didn't have a strong opinion on boxing one way or the other. But what I did start to read, there's a sociologist named Louis Coquant who wrote a book about boxing. It's called Notebook of an Apprentice Boxer. And he actually boxed at a Woodlawn boxing gym as a sociologist, kind of immersed in a neighborhood boxing gym. And then he ended up fighting Golden Gloves, and so he wrote this sort of memoir. And it's a fascinating book because it's, one of the things it says, if you want to look and see who's on the bottom of society, just look and see who's boxing. And it's really very true if you look at every immigrant group come through. But the other thing that he references that I thought was so true is boxing is one of really the only places where you can really allow there to be intimacy between two men. Because when the boxer is gloved up and with his mouth guard, and his coach is wrapping his hands, he's preparing him to go into the ring. And then when he's in the ring, he's giving him water and wiping blood and sweat and everything. And you're just, as a boxer, you're completely helpless, dependent like a baby on this typically other man. And that's not a type of intimacy or relationship that we get to see in society very much between a young boy or teenage boy and an older man.
So that vulnerability is sort of coded into the movements of a sport?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that rises to the level of their awareness that this is a valuable exercise in vulnerability?
No. I think it's probably the opposite. I think that they're able to sort of mask the actual vulnerability behind sort of really being part of this guild of warriors.
So my next question would be, what age group are you working with in the...
So the boxing gym is 8 and up, but we did have, and still there's kids that come as just younger siblings, so depending, and they'll kind of do their thing. But it's going up to adults. Some of the youth have been there for a very long time, and they continue to come back. They'll leave for a while. while and they'll come back. I actually just heard from one of the girls who was part of the Too Young to Die project. And then one of Frederick, again, he ended up going to jail for a bit of time, and he actually came back to the boxing gym before he even went home after being released. He had actually been looking at a 20 to 60 year sentence, and he went to trial. He was acquitted even after serving that length of time in county and going through the trial, came to the boxing gym before even going home. So it's a special place, and I think that goes to the sense of belonging. So while they might not necessarily get the vulnerability aspect, what they do say over and over and over again is it's a family. So there's just really a sense of belonging. And I think even going back to the issue of food at school, we all nurture through food, right? And so if you're being served slop, it's very hard for you to feel cared for and a sense of belonging. And then if you're not feeling that you belong to an institution, it's hard to then participate.
Given that the boxing club offers that belonging, do we see then an effort to perhaps protect the institution if it's, in danger?
On behalf of the youth?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're very protective of the boxing gym. I think there's a great fondness for the boxing gym for the youth that have grown up and aged out. I won't say aged out because they could continue to come, but many have just, kind of moved on. And those that are still there, it's very much a sense of pride for them to be there. And it also has a defensive factor for them. So they'll run through the neighborhood, for example, right, as part of their training curriculum, and they'll wrap their hands so that when they're out running, they're identified as a boxer. And typically that will mean that other kids in the neighborhood will just leave them alone. Or they'll, as they're walking to the gym, because sometimes just going block by block is an issue in the neighborhood, they'll wear their gloves over their shoulders so people will identify them as, not because they're necessarily afraid of them, like, oh, that's a boxer, so I don't want to mess with them, but just more out of a respect. Like a lot of times if other youth do see that you're involved in something, they will kind of leave you alone a little bit and give you your space. The other thing that happens is there's a little bit of a rivalry where the church is located is it's kind of at the intersection between North Lawndale and South Lawndale. South Lawndale is a little village. North Lawndale is a predominantly Black community. South Lawndale is a predominantly Latino community. So there have been tensions between those communities for many years now, going back to the 60s. And it's also located kind of at the dividing line between two of the major street gangs. So it's very interesting geographically that it can pull from all of these places, and yet it's just a safe space for everybody to come.
How do those dynamics figure into the environment? Are they addressed explicitly, or are there just expectations that people will abide by the ground rules there?
It's a mix of both. Historically, the culture of the boxing gym has just been a very no-nonsense type of culture, right? So one of the first coaches, called him Chupi, William Rodriguez was his name, and he had come out of Windy City boxing gym, so he had been coaching boxing at that time for over 20 years. He's since passed away, but he was just very, very no-nonsense. He was just an old-school Puerto Rican guy, and if you were standing around and doing nothing, he was going to be on you. Like, you're not here for that. This is not your living room. You want to be in your living room? Go home. You want to box? This is what we're here for. And so at the time, when I first came in, because I'm kind of coming from a lens of philanthropy and grant writing and wanting to frame what the gym was doing in a way that would help them access resources, but they were kind of still thinking, well, it's a boxing gym. And so I'd say, well, it's youth development. And so Chupi and I would go back and forth. And at one point we were having a conversation, it was getting a little bit heated, and Pastor Victor had to kind of, calm us down, because either he or I were going to go over the table toward the other one in just a minute, And so we finally decided that it was both youth development and a boxing gym. But, Chupi would always joke, because he was just so old school, he'd say, youth development, I'll give you youth development. He'd kind of just jokingly kind of knock the kid on the head, like, no, Chupi, that's not youth development. But to some extent, it did work that way, because the common thread, I would say, between myself, between Chupi, and between Pastor Victor, is that we are all sort of a bit older school, tough love type of people. And I think that that's something that I personally see a movement away from that right now in terms of youth work, where it's a little bit more of some of it, and I don't want to be like, but some of it I feel like there's a little bit too much coddling.
Well, there's a lot of evidence to support that. What kind of coddling have you seen in the work environments that you've been around, and what kind of effects is that having on the young people?
The city, interestingly, and I think it's great, right, that they're interested in wanting to give youth more job opportunities. Years ago, there was an initiative, it ended up being the subject of an FBI investigation, but we did hire youth through it from the church, and I was so disappointed because they were basically hiring youth to pass out flyers, and it was a campaign thing essentially to get people on the payroll, but all these things like youth, they couldn't be outside passing out flyers, and they wanted them to go to different places that they couldn't go, and it just didn't feel meaningful, or it was just, and so from that, I'm going to say that was probably in 2010 or 11. From that, I just kind of determined to say, no, if we're going to hire youth, we need to give them an actual professional job experience so that they know what it is to go through an interview, so that they know what it is to, that you send them a thank you email as a follow-up after an interview. Because we don't know until we know. Like, I didn't grow up knowing those things, and my mother had to teach me those things, and she didn't grow up knowing those things. And so you don't know unless somebody tells you. But I think now it's still too much of we just want to put youth on the payroll, and there's not necessarily that perspective of we want them to actually have an interview, we want them to actually, the disservice of that is then they go out into the workforce that's not connected to the nonprofit sector, that's not connected to a church, and they have no idea what to expect, and all of a sudden it's like, what do you mean they don't care about my social emotional needs? What do you mean this is not, and it's just, Target doesn't, I'm sorry, but that's just the reality, and so you're setting them up for failure, I think, if you're not giving them a real experience. And I'm not saying that means it should feel unsafe, but I do think that there needs to be just a real preparation for what is it that you're trying to provide, because you're trying to provide the job, but you're also servicing them. You're trying to provide a service at the same time. I think there's almost too much money out the door that's going toward things that get popular.
There's a famous book that came out a few years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind.
Interesting.
It maps on perfectly with your point. The opening quote from that book is, "Prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child." We want to create that meaningful experience rather than like a mindless experience. Your old-fashioned philosophy, how do you think that is equipping the young people for a life as a citizen in their community?
I wish I could say that I felt better about it, to be very honest with you. Sometimes I feel like I'm really an anomaly these days, right? Chuppy passed away, Pastor Victor passed away, and I'm just kind of like, where are my brothers here in this? Because as a woman, it's also a little bit harder for me to play that role in the way that a man can play that role, right? Because as a woman, I'm come across in that way, like, oh, she's just too strict, or she's, a B, or blah, 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 kind of thing. And I don't think I am. If I see you standing around, I'm going to ask you to clock out and go home, because don't get to sit here and make money, just stand around. And I'm going to talk to you about it and explain why. But, one of my kind of famous quotes, for better or for worse, that I'm known for is, I'm not here to rub sunshine up your, I don't know how well young people are going to perceive that right off the bat, to be honest with you. And I think more and more it's a little startling for the younger ones, and I'm finding that more and more, right? Because as I've been, so for example with Frederick, who now is a good friend, and he's actually trying to start his own boxing organization now, very much along the lines of CYBC, and I'm trying to find time to walk alongside him with that. But he'll absolutely get it. I mean, there were times when it was not me, but there was somebody else in the church where he was actually held lock-kneed over a railing because it was like, no, you're going to shape up. Not that I'm condoning that, but this would not be shocking to him, right? To hear me say, I mean, he knows at that time I had 3 Facebook profiles and I just kind of follow him around. You know I'm going to be peeping you, right? And he just laughs, but he knows that I'm strict. He knows that he's not going to run game on me. And so I think that's also now 2 generations removed, and I just, as each generation, but I'm not thinking in terms of 20-year generations with youth. I'm thinking more of a 10-year cohort. They just seem to get, just a noticeable difference.
Right.
It really is a noticeable difference. My sons and I have this running joke that I think that like so much of what's wrong with the world right now has to do with participation trophies. I don't agree that you're damaging a child by allowing them to just acknowledge that they didn't excel in this particular area. I think that's a healthy thing. I think personally that's healthy. And it's not to say that, you're telling them that they failed. How are you creating a ladder of achievement and excellence and striving if you're not letting there be a ladder and everything is just sort of horizontal? I think it's disorienting.
I do think we see the effects of that in our academic environment as well when we work with students. All of a sudden, I have anxiety, I cannot work again. Mental issues. It's very challenging for us as well to work with these younger generations of students and trying to push them, right, to grow in various areas. But I never thought about that side of the world that you're in and that you're struggling with kind of the same issues. For us, it's grace, for you, is a paycheck.
When Frederick got into trouble, he had actually at one point become a very good amateur boxer in a national level. So he fought in a national competition. He came in 4th place. To him, that was a failure because he didn't win. We didn't know that at the time at the boxing gym. So we didn't understand that he was internalizing this failure, and then, he went out and got deeper involved in some things that he shouldn't have been getting involved in. And he has since a series of fits and starts, but he's definitely, been able to kind of right the ship. He just finished school with a business degree. But I do think that we want to be checking in for sure, and I do think that we want to be sensitive, and I do think that we want to have a developmental approach, but I don't think that it should, I feel like I see a lot of parentification, where sometimes I even feel like infantilized, right? Like this person is, and I'm just like, no, this is not, it's, so we have to really kind of be very careful with the dynamics that we're creating, because it does sort of also go to, I think, their success, right, in the future. There is something to be said for just being teachable, coachable. I don't think that's a value that we're doing enough to instill. And I'm going to go a little old school. I do think that there's something to be said for just speaking respectfully, and I see that eroding. And because you just get farther in life when people like you. You just do, if you know how to talk to people in a way and get your point across. And I think even with the job experience, we're having, one of the things, of course, is the cell phones, right? Everybody wants to be on their cell phone all day long. And so we're trying to explain you can't be on your cell phone all day long at work. And so then in one particular situation, after I had reminded somebody several times over a period of several days, and then it was continuing to happen, so I sort of pulled that person on the side and I said, this is not the first time that I'm bringing this to your attention. You can't be on the phone. And there was just this very defensive reaction and disrespectful reaction, honestly, of, well, my mom was texting me and I am not going to not respond to my mom. Nobody's telling you that you can't respond to your mom, but can you respond to your mom and then put the phone away? But I do think that that's also one of the things now that I want to kind of build in is working with the parents, because I think a lot of parents don't understand. They can't be texting their child when they're working or at school, right? You shouldn't really be doing that. Now with the phones, everybody thinks they have immediate access to their kid all day long, but when your child is working, they're working, and you're not helping them succeed in the world if you're texting them all day long and expecting them to be immediately available. And granted, there's emergencies, and I completely understand that, but if things can wait, they should wait until the workday is over. I was raised by a single mom, and she would always say to us, if you're working and you're not actually working, you're stealing time, you're stealing, so I just always have this value in my head of that kind of work ethic. If you're being paid by somebody and you're not doing the work that you're being paid to do, then you're effectively stealing that time.
So a lot of work to do there, right?
There's a lot of work to do there. Yeah. There really is, and I am passionate about that work, because I do think that I really want them to know, because I think ultimately these are just sort of those, and we talk about them as soft skills, and I think it's soft skills, but I think it's also just basics of interpersonal skills and understanding how to solve problems in a way that is respectful. I'm wondering, right, in my mind, if part of this is coming from a sense of, I feel like I'm always kind of getting screwed, so I'm going to come out the gate fighting. Yeah. Maybe that is, but I do see more and more youth who are just, they're coming out the gate fighting, and I have to say, okay, right now you're accusing me of something, so let's take that down for a second, and just what is it that you want to talk about.
Definitely very interesting, because that's what we have here at National Louis. To some extent, we have youth who are acting out in classes, and the idea is, well, they're coming from environments where there's very little control over things that are happening to them. Hence, then the NLU space is the safe space where you can start acting out. It's not just the educational space that has that type of behavior. I understand now. It's also the professional or semi-professional.
It is, and I think that part of it also relates to, so as the nonprofit sector continues to grow and continues to sort of do the work that government at one time was trying to do, there's sort of this process by where nonprofits are trying to set policy, right? So policy is getting set in all these sort of de facto ways. It gets set by philanthropy, because if something doesn't have money to operate, it's de facto setting a policy that that's not what's going to be moving forward. And nonprofits the same way, but I also think that because there's, like, as long as I've been doing this work, I've never seen so much money. I have just never seen so much money. It is just like what we used to call in grant making sort of a spray and pray type of proposal, where you just throw everything at the wall and hope something will stick. But that's what I see the opposite side of now. I see philanthropy, just spray and pray, just throw dollars and hope that something will stick. And so I think a lot of that is also sort of feeding that dynamic in a sense, right? Because increasingly I see that our idea now of working with youth isn't really to conscientionize youth, it's to feed them pizza and hope they don't shoot anybody. And there has to be more to youth development than feeding pizza. I think we've lowered the bar for not just the youth, but for the providers. When data started becoming such a thing, right, where we want to know your numbers, right, then that is what's driving so much of the service sector is, we have to up our numbers. And there's really no value for, we're working with 5 youth, but we're really working deep with these 5 youth across a spectrum of life skills and emotional things and trajectories, and getting them really connected to services, whatever that might be, if it's mental health, if it's workforce, if it's education, and it might be all of the above. But instead, with the numbers-driven approach, it's kind of distilled down to how many kids did you serve today. One of the other projects that we did with the boxing gym was a national project with Mexico. Before I joined the board and became the executive director of the boxing gym, I was doing capacity building, technical assistance for a few nonprofit organizations, and I wrote a grant for 2 of them to the MacArthur Foundation, who was doing a program at that time called International Connections. And so we received funding through that program to take youth from the boxing program and from another organization called Latinos Progresando. They had a youth theater program that was based on the immigration experience. And so those 2 cohorts of youth, we went to a rural community in Mexico, stayed there for 2 weeks, and did theater boxing programming with the youth there. In this particular community, there was no water. Now, I had come to know this particular community a couple of years before, because I was working again on grant making, and it was a World Bank model. They were funding projects, income generating projects. So there were all of these remittances going. So at that point in Mexico, there was literally $50 million a day in remittances that were going into Mexico. So it had become third largest source of GDP for Mexico. It was just what the migrants were sending home. So the World Bank was trying to kind of figure out, okay, well, how can we funnel this into not just big screen TVs and trucks, but how can we actually turn this into income generating projects? So then they had this idea that everybody should become an entrepreneur, right? So as part of this grant making initiative, we had $1 million to deploy in this particular state of Mexico, which was Guanajuato, and we couldn't deploy it. So this one project that got funded was $250,000 over 3 years. And the community had a population of 220 people. Per capita basis, like, wow, you could just kind of give all the money, you know, and they could probably be life-changing for them. It made no sense to the community because they didn't understand what they were being asked to do. There was all this paperwork. It was the World Bank. They were being asked to sort of like keep their goats that were funded from the project separate from these other goats that they already had. And it was like, well, but I have a perfectly good pen over here. Why should I keep these goats separate from those goats? They didn't understand just the whole logic behind it. It was just completely foreign. So that was a $250,000 grant over 3 years that went nowhere. Fast forward a couple years, we get this grant from the MacArthur Foundation. We take these youth there, and at the end of the 2 weeks, I asked all of them, what would you do here in this community if you had $10,000? And every single one said water. So we talked to the people there and figured out that they know how to harvest water through cisterns, but they just didn't have the money to build the cisterns. So with the youth in the boxing gym, we raised $10,200. We're able to build cisterns for every single household in the community. And again, it's that relationship piece, right? You can have $250,000, but if you don't have the relationship with the people to know what is going to actually work for them to make a difference, then it's not going to be as impactful as $10,000 that then makes really a life-changing difference because you've sat with them and had actual relationship with them of discerning what it is that they actually need.
So the scale is less important. It's more about whether it's transactional or transformational. And the work you've done that you've been most proud of has been transformational.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet how transformational. I mean, I think that example of the water project definitely is one, you know, that I would say is transformational. But I think relational, because relationships, they're alive, they're dynamic, they continue to grow. I mean, just like this example of Frederick that I keep going back to. I've known him since he was, 12 years old, and now he's engaged and just got a business degree. And so now we're working more as colleagues. That's the value of what that relationship piece really means. It's that unidirectional kind of transactional thing. Let's solve this problem together.
I would like to go back to this project that I read about recently, the right capacity building project that you've been involved with UIC, Latino serving, community serving institutions that we have in the Chicago area, and the findings of the project, which were interesting to say the least. Could you summarize?
Así Hacemos actually came out of, again, meeting with Latino nonprofit organizations who I was reviewing for grants and just trying to talk to them about their needs. And I kept sort of hearing that they just didn't feel like they were getting their fair share. In all honesty, what one of the examples was coming up most frequently was United Way, where they didn't feel like they were getting any access to United Way funding. And so it kind of came from that. So instead of just sort of saying we don't feel like we're getting our fair share, like can we find data to see if they are in fact getting their fair share or not. So we sat down with a colleague of mine, Becca Levin. She has a PhD in evaluation. And she actually was also at the University of Chicago, but she focuses more on participatory research and community-based research. So I had met her years before when I was still actually doing rape crisis counseling. So I brought her in to kind of ask how would we gather these data and how would we look at United Way, and she said, well, you really can't sort of pick on one entity. You have to make it a participatory approach, otherwise people are going to be alienated by what you're trying to do. So that was definitely good guidance on that. But we ended up serving 66 Latino-led, Latino-serving nonprofits in the Metro Chicago Chicago area. We did find, I would say, that they really weren't getting their fair share, and sort of broke down their funding. We looked at who was funding them, and by who's funding we included city, state, and federal sources of funding. We looked at foundation funding, we looked at corporate funding, we looked at what they were generating on their own through fundraisers and income generating programs or projects, and then we looked at also United Way. One thing that was very interesting was that the funding of, I think at that time there were 1,200 foundations. Well, they were funding in Metro Chicago, and by far the most resources that were going to Latino nonprofits were from 8 foundations. And in the top 10 largest foundations operating in Metro Chicago at that time, some had offered no grants at all to Latino nonprofits. And by Latino nonprofits, we defined that term as intentionally, explicitly serving Latino community as part of their mission statement, and also that either their executive director or majority of their board were identified as Latino. So that was one of the major findings. Another one was that it was taking them, there seemed to be sort of this sticking point between getting to about $1 million in a budget and a $2 million budget, so that there was some sort of critical something that was happening that they just would kind of hit this wall at about $1 million and then have a very, very hard time getting past that. The other thing was that particularly the state funding was much harder to access for the smaller Latino organizations. And then one of the biggest data points was that they had all across the board controlling for size, for the length of years they had been operating, had just lost significant income over the past 2 years, and that was 2009. So yeah, that was during the economic crisis. What's not in the report, and a big takeaway I think for me in designing the study if I had to do it over again. So we collected all the data, we analyzed, we drafted the report, and then before the actual report was published, which was in March, that January, 2 months before, we presented all of the results at a community meeting with both the funders and the organizations themselves that were surveyed, because we wanted to get their input to put it into the report as well. And so what I think was so interesting and I didn't expect was that a lot of the organizations struggled to know then how to take that data and leverage it into funding. You know, how could they take that data and explain it to a funder, sort of taking the numbers and making the case. At the time, Sylvia Puente, now the executive director of the Latino Policy Forum, she was just coming on to the Latino Policy Forum at that time. And so she took the data and she ran with it because she just, you know, she's a data person, she gets it, she comes out of an academic setting. So she has probably leveraged that data 10 times over in terms of getting state resources, not just for Latino Policy Forum, but for the sector as a whole. And there was some transformational change that she was able to leverage because she's a very data savvy person. But the grassroots organizations really struggled. And so it ended up, I guess I kind of fear that did it end up sort of just reinforcing the message of, yeah, we're getting screwed, you know, and then that wasn't really supposed to be the so what. The so what was supposed to be, you know, you have evidence and you can take the evidence and do something with it and actually say that there's an inequity here, there's a lack of opportunity here. And that's what I would do, I think, differently, again, is build in something to the process of actually helping then the organizations talk about the data and make actual practical use of it.
I think all the work you've done has been to rectify inequity and to create, like you said, that relational component to spark change.
The May Foundation, we saw it mentioned on your CV. Could you quickly explain what that is?
Yeah, so the May Foundation started, I was actually working at the Staines Family Foundation at the time. My ex-husband and I, at the time we were still married, sold a company, a financial services software company, and that was how the May Foundation was established. But it's a very, very small foundation, dollar-wise, or was. So as part of what I was really able to offer wasn't so much the monetary support, that was part of it, but it was the technical assistance. So it was kind of like if you're familiar with Taproot, like low-key, where it was like give in-kind technical assistance as the grant making, and then there would be other funding, monetary, that could or could not come along with that, just depending on how. And that model really kind of came out of Staines because, I was there as a program officer and feeling really influenced by the way that they work with their grant making. So it wasn't so much a transactional approach of hang a shingle. They would sometimes shepherd organizations along for 3 years or 4 years before they would actually make a grant because they wanted them to be ready. And I know that there could be some pushback on that, but I will say that the organizations, at that time I was in North Lawndale with Staines, and now I'm back in North Lawndale again. The organizations that I was part of the Staines Foundation developing and seeding are there, and there's some of the strongest organizations in North Lawndale now. So it did work. At that time, we were developing the North Lawndale Employment Network, which is now a very, very big resource in the community. Lawndale Christian Housing Corporation, an organization called Why Men that was just being seeded and starting up at that time. And so I do think that it's a worthwhile approach, definitely a non-conventional approach.
Thank you so much. We're very grateful for you coming and joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This is the Growing Democracy team at National Louis University. Stay tuned for more episodes.